Well, good morning. Today's one of those days where I've got more to say than I've got time to say it. But we're talking about sort of forgotten people of the Bible. And typically we've been looking at Old Testament figures. We've been talking about those that sort of played a minor role in the Bible but had something of a major influence, or they showed us something about Christ. Today, I want to just talk about sort of a fascination of mine. Somebody that I'm fascinated with, but he figures prominently because I would argue that really nobody quite affects New Testament history like this guy, other than perhaps Augustus Caesar. And the person I want to talk about today is Herod the Great. Now, I'm going to sort of give you Herod the Great's family tree and look at the way he influences the New Testament. But just to talk about him a little bit at first, and then we'll talk about all those people that came out of him. So Herod the Great is a fascinating figure for a lot of reasons. One is that he is a Jew, sort of, but not really. So he's born in 73 BC, right? And he's the son of a guy of the merchant class, a guy named Antipater. Looks like Antipater. And Antipater is an Idumean, meaning that sounds like it's sort of just a corruption of the word Edomite. So he's a descendant of Esau. Isn't that fascinating? So we've talked about Jacob and Esau. And the Edomites are cursed people. You get, if you've been here for Wednesday night Psalm studies, we've talked about, we recently had an imprecatory psalm that was directed against the Edomites. And it's, happy are those, whoever smashes your little ones against a wall is going to be happy. So the Edomites cheered on the destruction of Jerusalem and the captivity of the Jews while Babylon was attacking. They helped Babylon even against their own distant brothers there. And so the Edomites are a cursed people. God prophesied against the Edomites in many of the Old Testament prophets. And here is Antipater, so he's an Idumean. He's part of what was called the Nabatean kingdom. Now, all of you have seen pictures of the capital of the Nabatean kingdom. I can almost guarantee it because the capital was Petra. So have you seen pictures of Petra? If you've ever seen which one of the Indiana Jones movies, I forget which one, takes place.
Last Crusade.
What is it?
Last Crusade.
The Last Crusade? Yeah, it's filmed there at Petra. I've not been to Petra since 1976. I was 16 and I've never been back. But it hadn't changed much. Pretty sure of that. It's still those incredible buildings cut out of the rock there in Jordan. So it's modern day Jordan. And that was the Nabatean kingdom. And Antipater comes out of that and comes over across the Jordan River into the land of Israel and becomes a trader there. Now, the ruling class at that time, so what happens between the Old Testament and the New Testament is a Jewish revolt and independence led by a family called the Maccabees. So Catholic Bibles have 1st and 2nd Maccabees in it. I don't believe they're canonical books. I don't accept them as scripture, but they're great history. And I do believe God preserved the Jewish people through the Maccabees, and they become the ruling class, and their dynasty in Israel is called the Hasmonean dynasty. So the descendants of the Maccabees that rule in Israel are called the Hasmoneans, and they control the sort of the political scene and the religious scene. So guy named John Hyrcanus is the high priest, and he's a Hasmonean. So Antipater is very supportive of this Hasmonean dynasty. He has two sons, Herod's older brother and Herod, and he ingratiates himself to them. But again, you've still got then the world powers that are on the scene, a lot of flux. So Rome is just sort of coming into its what's later called the Pax Romana. So this is during the time of Julius Caesar. Caesar's expanding Rome. But around Israel, you've got the Nabatean kingdom, you've got the Parthians, and Rome. You've got down in Egypt, you have remember Alexander, when he died, he split up his kingdom in 4 different ways. And so Cleopatra is part of the family down in Egypt. They're a Greek family, but they're ruling in Egypt. And so you've got all these world powers jockeying for position. They all want Israel. What Antipater does is he becomes friends of Julius Caesar's, and he gets his sons appointed governors in essence, and his older son has control of Jerusalem down there in the southern part, and Herod is up in Galilee. So let me get to my. So in 40 BC, the Parthians invade Palestine or Israel, and civil war breaks out. And because Herod was aligned with the Romans and with the Hasmoneans, he's got to flee, and he flees to Rome because the Parthians want to kill him. Remember, now he's a young guy. He's not yet Herod the Great. He's not yet a king. He's sort of a military governor. And by the way, Herod doesn't get his due militarily. Herod had an ability. He could ride, like he could hold onto a horse with his legs and ride sideways, like halfway down the side of the horse, and shoot an arrow and thread a small hole. They said he was a phenomenal warrior and a great leader, but he was no idiot. He knew when he was going to be beaten, and here comes the Parthian army, and they're out to get him because he's the ruler. So they, in 63, in 40 BC, the Parthians invade Palestine. Civil war breaks out. Herod flees to Rome. And there the Senate nominates him King of Judea, and they give him that title, King of Judea, and they equip him with an army to fight the Parthians. So in the year 37, at the age of 36, Herod becomes the unchallenged ruler of Judea, a position he will maintain for 32 years. And so he goes back down, he drives the Parthians out, but his older brother got killed, or actually killed himself. He was captured and killed himself in his cell rather than to be tortured. So Herod becomes the only descendant of his father. He becomes he gets the Roman right to be called king. Let me pause here. This explains, remember, Jesus told a parable about a man who went into a far country and received a kingdom. Now that makes no sense to us. That sounds weird to us because we picture a kingdom as like the realm over which you reign. And how do you go into a far country and get a kingdom? But the word kingdom means rule, authority, kingship. And when Jesus told that story, everybody in his original audience knew historically that very thing had happened, that Herod had gone into a far country to receive a kingship. So Rome calls him king. He comes back now with an army and the title and the right to rule as king. And so when he comes back from Rome with his army, drives the Parthians out. He really wants to solidify his power, so he divorces his wife. Her name was Doris, my mother's name. Can't forget Doris, but he gets rid of Doris, and he marries. It looks like Miriamne. All right, so here's Herod the Great, and he's going to have multiple wives. The one we're most interested in here at first is, it looks like Mariamne, and some people pronounce it that way. It's usually the N is silent, and it's just pronounced Miriam. And so she's actually the first, because he's going to marry another wife later. He kills her. He's going to kill Miriam, but she's his favorite wife, and he killed his favorite wife. And later he marries another woman and names her Miriam in honor of the wife he killed. I know you're going, and you admire this guy. Well, not for that. But we'll talk about that. So he marries Miriam. The thing about her is she's the daughter of the high priest, and as a Hasmonean, so her child would have a claim to the throne. So Herod marries her in order to sort of tap into the aura of the Hasmonean dynasty. So here he is an Edomite. By the way, I don't think I mentioned to you that his father Antipater did convert to Judaism. So he's of Edomite descent, but he did become a Jew. And so Herod is raised with Jewish customs and raised as a Jew, though his DNA is not Jewish. You understand? So he marries Miriam, because you don't get more Jewish than this. This is the daughter of the high priest, and she's a Hasmonean. She's a descendant of the Maccabees, and so this sort of solidifies Herod as a Jew, so he can rightfully be called King of the Jews. And so when he does this, but by the way, at the same time, and this is the way ancient kingdoms work, this makes his sons his greatest threat, because they have real Hasmonean blood, and there will be those in Israel who will want them to take the throne away from Herod. So guess what he'll do to his sons? He will eliminate them, the two sons of Miriam. And this is why later Augustus will say of Herod, I'd rather be, because Herod's a practicing Jew, he doesn't eat pork. Augustus would say of Herod, I'd rather be his pig than his son. He won't eat pork, but he will kill his children. And so this is just how ruthless he is. So anyway, he marries Miriam, a Hasmonean princess, but he's deeply in love with Miriam, but she is not so much in love with him, and eventually he'll put her to death. So while this is going on, Julius Caesar dies, and there's a civil war in Rome. There's a battle between Mark Antony, who, of course, is allied with Cleopatra in Egypt, and Mark Antony and a guy named Octavian, who we know from the Bible as Caesar Augustus. So they're fighting for control of Rome. They each have part of the Roman army. They have a civil war, and Herod, you can't remain neutral. You got to pick a side. And Herod really believes that Mark Antony will win. And he totally throws his weight behind Mark Antony. And even though Cleopatra has done him dirt, Cleopatra got Mark Antony to give a lot of Herod's territory to her so she could rule. Like down in Jericho, they produced a lot of spices, eucalyptus and things like this, and it was really a fertile plain. Herod had a palace over there, Jericho, and Cleopatra got Mark Antony to cede all of that land to Egypt. And Herod knew he had no cards he could play. There was nothing he could do about that but bide his time. Now here's the genius of Herod. He can always read the political situation and figure out the way to survive. I mean, you've got all these wars going on all around him, and everybody wants a piece of Israel. Herod figures out how to stay afloat. And so even when Mark Antony gives away a lot of his land to Cleopatra, who Herod does not like and she does not like him, Herod does nothing. He just waits. He figures things will change eventually. And so indeed, Mark Antony and Octavian finally have the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, and Octavian wins. And Herod had cast, he'd put all his money on Mark Antony. He'd been his vassal, and now Octavian has won. So what would you do? What would you do if the guy you have supported and fought for Mark Antony, and now Octavian wins? Most guys would just sort of prepare for a battle. But Herod does not do that. Herod knows, he figures out he can't win. What he does is he immediately goes to Rome. And he goes right into the presence of Octavian, who's now Caesar Augustus. And this is one of the biggest gambles in history. If Octavian is ticked at him, he'll just kill him on the spot. I mean, he's a dead man. But Herod knows this is his only hope. So he goes to Octavian and he says, I want you to see how loyal I am. I was loyal to Mark Antony. I pledged him my troops, my support, and I gave it to him. He lost. And I will be as loyal to you as I was to him. You will never have to worry about me. I give you my word. I'm for you. And Octavian is impressed that the guy has the guts to do this. And he says, okay. And makes him ruler. And he restores the land to Herod that Mark Antony had taken away and given to Cleopatra. So Herod comes out of it. He got his land back. He's now in total favor of Rome. Caesar Augustus is going to have a long and prosperous reign that will benefit Herod. And he gives Herod pretty much free reign during all that time. Herod becomes the close friend of Augustus's minister, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. You hear that word? You hear Agrippa. So Herod's going to name one of his sons after Agrippa. A grandson of his is going to be named after Agrippa. Agrippa is sort of the chief of staff for Caesar Augustus, and then he's going to make sure that Herod is taken care of. So Augustus gives him the oversight of the copper mines on Cyprus. He gives him access to vast wealth, and he twice increased Herod's territory in the years 22 and 20 BC, so that it came to include not only Palestine, but what we now call Jordan to the east of the river, southern Lebanon, Syria. Caesar Augustus gave all that to Herod to rule, and he was going to give him the Nabatean kingdom as well, like Petra and all that. But toward the end of his life, Herod begins to get crazy, and Augustus knows it, and so he doesn't give him any more. But let's talk about Herod before he got crazy. So before I talk about his family, let's just talk about what he did. All right, we can understand how Herod became a great military leader because he fought. That's how you get to be good at war. You fight, and especially early. I mean, there's a scene in which the religious guys in Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin early on in Herod's reign doesn't like him, and he just shows up in in Jerusalem with an army. He doesn't say anything. He just rides into town with an army, and they very quickly retreat from their opposition to Herod. He just knows the way to sort of always show power, we know how he's a military leader, and he thinks militarily because he grew up fighting. What we don't know about him is how he became one of the greatest architects the world has ever known. And there is no explanation of it. But Herod built stuff that still stands to this day. He built stuff that still works to this day. He did things that no one had ever done before. So the main thing two big things he did for Israel. I'm going to talk about his palaces in a moment, but two huge things that he did for Israel. One is that he gave Israel a port. So you've got, this is the coastline of Israel. This is a bad marker. So you've got the coastline of Israel coming down. There's a little thing up here that juts up near Haifa, sort of goes out like that. But if you notice this nice, smooth, beachy coastline, what you don't have is a port. There's no place for ships to arrive and for goods to be taken off. I mean, you've got to anchor your ships out there offshore, and then take little boats and shuttle stuff in back and forth, tender it in. By the way, even in, like, I read a biography of the Spaffords, the guy that wrote It Is Well With My Soul, and it talked about when they moved to Israel, they got dumped offshore right outside of modern-day outside of Joppa, modern-day Tel Aviv, and literally waded ashore. I mean, there was no place for boats to come in. So Herod builds a sunken port. He figures out. So if you're going to give Israel a port, how do you do it? What do you do? Well, you've got to have a breakwater, something. So you always got waves coming to the shore. So you got to build a breakwater, something out there that will break the waves, and then inside it, you've got to dredge out the sand and the rocks and stuff to give it depth. And then you've got to make it where, sand and stuff can't wash in and just fill it in. I mean, if you dig it out, eventually the sea's going to reclaim it, right? So Herod figured out a way to pour concrete underwater. How do you get concrete to set and harden underwater? And Herod designed a way for them to do it. And they poured this concrete. They brought volcanic ash from Italy by the shiploads. I read, something like, I don't know how many dozens of shiploads of this ash. And the fact that he knew this ash could be made concrete that would set underwater, how he knew it, who knows? But so he builds this breakwater, and then he digs this harbor, and then they pour concrete and set it under the water, set everything into place. So now you've got a floor that will maintain the depth. It will not erode. The breakwater will keep the waves from bringing more sand in, and ships can get in there and pull right up to the dock, unload their goods, and now for the first time in its history, Israel has a port. And by the way, it's because of that Paul's imprisonment, did I tell you what he named that town? Caesarea, after his patron Caesar Augustus. So he names it Caesarea. It's called, there are two Caesareas in the land of Israel. He called this one Caesarea Maritima. So the maritime Caesarea, Caesarea of the sea. And it's actually, I put it up a little too high. It's down around in here. And when we go to Israel, that's our first stop, first morning. We get up and eat breakfast and go to Caesarea Maritima. It's a phenomenal town. What is exposed today is only a small fraction of the huge metropolis that it became. There's an amphitheater there that seated, I don't know, 20,000 people. It's a massive thing. There's a hippodrome, horse track for chariot races, like you see in Ben-Hur, and they ran horses, and there's the dock. So the port that he created was eventually destroyed by earthquakes. So that part of the world is given to earthquakes, and that's the one thing that Herod could not protect that port against. So it's no longer a workable port, but you can see, if you go on, if you Google it, you can see aerial photos that look down through the clear water of the Mediterranean, and you can still see the features of Caesarea under the water. Herod was also famous for his palaces. They were architectural wonders. Every single palace that he built, and I think he had, I want to say, 7 of them, they all had a freshwater pool. The cool thing about the one at Caesarea is that it juts out into the water. It juts out into the ocean, and in the middle of the courtyard, jutting out into the ocean, there's a freshwater swimming pool. And Herod just did that. I mean, he figured out ways to catch water. In that part of the world that's so arid, catching and using water is a major thing, and Herod did it. So Caesarea is one of the 2 most significant things Herod did for Israel, because he gave them a port. It makes Caesarea a major trading place, and it's there from Caesarea that the gospel sounds out. Paul's imprisonment at Caesarea is significant because there he can meet with all these believers that are coming there. It's at Caesarea, he gets to give a defense, and he's there. His imprisonment lasts quite some time, I think 2 years, and so the gospel can sound out. So Caesarea, very significant thing that Herod gives. The second thing that he gives Israel is the temple. So if you want to solidify your rule and your reign as the king of the Jews, the one thing you can do that will make, and remember, the religious leaders didn't like Herod. He's not really a Jew. They're always suspicious of him. He's sort of, they see him as an interloper. He's taken over the Hasmonean line. So they didn't like him and they didn't trust him. So Herod knows that the one thing he can do that will make them feel ingratiated to him, grateful to him, is if he builds a temple. Because remember, the temple that existed at that time was, before Herod built his, was really a shadow of the Solomon's temple. The first temple had been glorious. Remember, when they rebuild the temple after the exile, they weep because the old people remember, it's not anything like the old one. It's not at all like Solomon's temple. Well, Herod's going to give them one greater than Solomon's temple. And so, true to form, not only does he give them a temple, he gives them an architectural wonder. So on that Temple Mount, right up there on Mount Zion, formerly the threshing floor of Araunah, formerly known as Mount Moriah, where Abraham offered Isaac. I mean, there's a lot of history on that mountain. Herod makes it level, and he does this by putting rock in a place. So you've got the natural bedrock that's up there, and Herod puts rock on top of the bedrock. In fact, the second largest building stone of the ancient world is up there on the Temple Mount. By testing it, we know it's not anything like the surrounding bedrock. So it's not from there, and it is something like 154 tons. It's massive, and we really don't know how they got it up there. I mean, how do you move a rock that big? It's massive. I mean, it's about like from this whole section. It's huge. We go up when we go to Israel. We go in a tunnel up by the Western Wall and see it. You can see it from inside that tunnel, and you can see where it's got little holes cut into the side. So they use something. They attach something into those little holes to lift it and leverage it. And they've got a little model in there that sort of suggests maybe this is how they did it. But we don't know. I mean, what wheel do you have big enough to get a rock like that up a mountain? And we don't know. And there's so much like that with what Herod did. And Herodian stones they didn't just put, like you see pictures of the Western Wall. What Jews don't like us calling it that, but we call it the Wailing Wall. And it's those stones that have been exposed to the elements they're pretty worn. The ones that people put prayers in between. But when you go up in that tunnel, those stones have been covered by dirt for 2,000 years, and they're pristine. It's like they got laid yesterday. And in fact, you go far enough up there, the far northwestern corner, you can see the stones they were working on the day Herod died. They're still carving them into shape, and they just stopped and walked away because there's no guarantee they're going to get paid, because the chances, nobody's like Herod. So the Temple Mount is an incredible phenomenon. He makes it glorious, beautiful, and it took 40 years to build it. And so this comes into play. The Jews have this great pride in it. And in Luke, we see the significance of the temple. So Jesus is dedicated at that temple. Jesus would have been born. So Herod dies in 4 BC. So Jesus is dedicated before Herod dies. And so probably 6 BC. He's dedicated, so the temple was still fairly new. I mean, and in fact, parts of it still under construction. So Jesus is dedicated in the temple, and then there's the scene when he's 12, he goes to the temple. Luke doesn't have him going back to the temple till chapter 19. The temple represents sort of the consummation of the ministry of Jesus, going to the temple because he's the new temple. All those discussions where Jesus talks about the temple. Destroy this temple, and I'll raise it up in 3 days. And the Jews are going, what? This thing was 40 years in being built, and you're going to build it in 3 days? What are you talking about? Of course, Jesus is talking about the temple of his flesh, not that temple. And so you see in the Gospels this theme of Jesus being the new temple. But that temple of Herod was glorious. But remember, Jesus says, hey, you're proud of this, aren't you? Well, there's not one stone here that's going to stay on top of another. And indeed, that's true. There's no stone of the temple left. I mean, you got the support. Basically, the Western Wall is just a retaining wall. It's like what somebody puts on the side of their driveway to hold their, if they've got a hilly yard to hold it in place. That's all the Western Wall is. It's just a retaining wall. It's not the temple. The temple was up on top, and what Jesus prophesied sure came true. I mean, not one stone left on top of another. And so Herod is significant because he gives Caesarea a port, and he gives the temple. The other thing that he does is he builds roads and aqueducts. He brings water to places, and in an arid part of the world, water is significant. But those are the two main things. I'll just tell you quickly, the palaces that he built some of them are still standing. The one at Jericho is gone. And that's under Palestinian control. That's on the West Bank. And there is no excavation going on there at all. It's a field, and it's, to me, tragic. Every time I go by it, there's incredible riches under there, but they're not doing anything with it. On the far side of the Dead Sea is a place called Machaerus, and there's some excavation going on there. That's in Jordan, and that's where John the Baptist was kept in prison. It was so Herod had a palace on both sides of the Dead Sea. He had one on the east side, which is over in Jordan. That's called Machaerus. On the west side, he had Masada. And so when Herod was on the run from the Parthians, at one point he took Miriam. Actually it was his first wife Doris, and his kids, and they went to Masada and they hid out in Masada. So there already was a fortress up on Masada. Herod hides there, falls in love with the place, and then later when he's king, he builds the most magnificent palace. Now, if you haven't seen pictures of Masada, Google it, look at it. It's phenomenal. There on the west side of the Dead Sea, there's this rock that just rises up out of the desert floor, and it's, I don't know, 2,500 feet high, something like that, and a flat plateau up on top. Herod builds, the first thing he does is he puts in a water catch system that catches water and channels it into these massive cisterns. So they build these cisterns underground. They carve out of the rock these deep cisterns, and all around the side of the mountain, you see these gutters that they cut into the rock. So when it rains and you get these massive storms that just drop an awful lot of water in a very short time, Herod catches it, channels it into these rooms of cisterns. So I'm going to say I've been in a cistern there on Masada that I don't know. It's about the size of that section of seats, maybe a little bigger. So you take a room, and it's deep, and it's as deep as this building. Some of you have been down in there with it. Wallace Kent, I remember Wallace Kent going down those stairs with us and back up. He had to stop and let his pacemaker catch up. And it's deep, man. It's deep. You go in there. We don't always go down in there, but it's that's life. You can't live up on that mountain without water, and there's no spring up there. Herod, you have to catch it and keep it, and he finds a way to catch it and keep it deep where it doesn't evaporate, and it's always there. And so, and if you look, the way he builds a palace that cascades down the side of the mountain, he has up there a system of saunas. You have 3 rooms for your sauna. You have your caldarium, which is basically your hot tub, and then you have the tepidarium, which is your lukewarm, and then you have the frigidarium, where you have cold water. And he didn't just have a sauna; he's got a hot room, a tepid room, and a cold room, and all up there. By the way, Herod, because he was a practicing Jew, did not allow any image of any living thing in there. So you go up on Masada, there are mosaics of all kind, but there's no faces, no animals. Why? Because that's a violation of the second commandment. And so Herod, here's the weird thing, is at the same time, Herod is very careful to observe those second commandment issues in Israel. He pays for idols to be made and temples to be built to the Roman gods elsewhere as a gift to Caesar. And so that sort of sums him up. He's always playing both sides. Herodium is the what is that? What is that? Oh, baptistry. Yeah, thank you. I can't tell where sound comes from, so I always have to know, what is it? I mean, is something terrible happening? I don't know. Anyway, as an illustration of the hot tub, we just turned it on. Just a few minutes late, but so Herodium is another one of his palaces, and it's where he was buried, and almost like a curse of that. A guy, Ehud Netzer, is the archaeologist who discovered his tomb there, and their Netzer Netzer, one of the two most famous archaeologists in Israel, discovers Herod's tomb there at Herodion, and while they're excavating it, it's up on the side. Herodion was built like a cone, and they had a catapult up on top with big round stones. The stones are still there, so if an enemy tries to attack, you just roll stones down at them, and there's no way to get up the smooth side of Herodion. It was impenetrable. And Herod is built into the side of it, halfway up. So Netzer, excavating it, comes out one day, and he's been bending down and doing the careful work of an archaeologist, and they had a rail up there to sort of keep people from falling. And Netzer had a way of, like, he would stretch and get up against something and sort of do his back like that. And he does that up against the rail, and the rail breaks, and he falls down, major head injury, died a few days later in the hospital. And, of course, it was the greatest discovery of his career, and it killed him. We always go to Herodion. Most trips that go to Israel don't go there. It's down on the West Bank, not far out of Bethlehem. But I take every trip, every group, we go there because it's fascinating, a place to see. There's never a crowd. We get it to ourselves pretty much. And man, it's where Herod was buried. And when you get up there, you can see it's not just that fortress. He had a whole city down below. You can see from the top of Herodion, you can see Masada and the Dead Sea. You can see Jerusalem. I mean, Herod, he did it right, man. So you have his palace at Caesarea, Herodion, Jericho, Machaerus, and then his palace in Jerusalem was a major palace, and there are excavations there. So he's an incredible, incredible builder. Now, how does he influence the New Testament? Well, obviously, you have the story of Jesus and when Jesus is a baby and the wise men coming and Herod saying, well, tell me where he is, and the slaughter of the innocents, as it's called. I want to point out to you that liberal scholars deny that actually happened. I mean, you read most commentaries on Matthew that are written by somebody that's not an evangelical, and they'll say, well, this certainly didn't really happen. There's no record of this happening anywhere else. Well, first of all, there's nothing in that story that is inconsistent with everything else we know about Herod. I mean, Herod kills his own kids. What's it to him to send armies down there to Bethlehem to kill everybody else's kids? And it's just because, Josephus tells a lot about Herod and gives us a lot of the detail. He tells us about John the Baptist. It's Josephus who tells us that John was in prison at Machaerus in the king's palace, in Herod's palace over there on the east side of the Jordan. We know a lot of detail from it, but Josephus doesn't mention anything about the slaughter of the innocents. We don't have any other record of it. Okay, but how much record do we need? I mean, the truth is, there's a lot of stuff Josephus tells us that nobody else tells us. We don't have any other record of it. Nobody goes, well, John the Baptist most certainly was not in prison at Machaerus, because that's the only record we have of that. So it's funny to me that they hold the Bible up to standards they don't hold other ancient histories up to. There's no question it happened. The Bible says it happened. I believe it because it's inspired. But secondly, there's nothing inconsistent about it. Herod was fully capable of slaughtering everybody else's kids because he slaughtered his own. So let's see how he figures out the influence he has. So Miriam the first is the Hasmonean princess who is his first wife. He has a wife named Malthace, another wife. Let me get rid of my map over here. Named, I already told you, Miriam the second. And then one called, guess what? Cleopatra, but not that Cleopatra. She was called Cleopatra of Jerusalem. And he had a lot of other wives. He married a lot of women, but these are significant because of the children that they had with him. So Malthace has two sons that figure in the New Testament. Herod Antipas, who is the one that John the Baptist rebukes because he's got his brother's wife, and the one that Jesus deals with, the Herod that Jesus goes before. His brother was named Herod Archelaus. Now you can see how confusing it gets with everybody named Herod. You got Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus. Miriam the second has a son named Herod Philip, and Cleopatra has a son named, in the New Testament, named Philip the Tetrarch. Now it gets confusing. Everybody's got the same name. You got all these Miriams. You got a lot of Herods and a couple of Philips, and then names of Caesars thrown in there. So it does get confusing. So Miriam has two sons. I'm not even going to bother naming them because Herod kills them. But from those two sons come two guys in the New Testament that you read about. Herod Agrippa. In the book of Acts, Agrippa the first is the one who imprisons Peter and kills James, the brother of John, James the son of Zebedee. And then Miriam also has a daughter named Herodias. All right, now this gets really incestuous. Sorry about that, but that's just the way ancient royal families did it. And Herodias is married to, first of all, Herod Philip, whom then she leaves and marries Herod Antipas. While she's married to Herod Philip, she has a daughter named Salome. Now, I don't think Salome's name is in the New Testament. I think I'm right about that. Josephus tells us that her name is Salome. But anyway, she's the daughter. I can't remember her name's in the New Testament or not. Anyway, she's the daughter who dances for her stepfather, and he says, I'll give you anything up to half my kingdom. And she says, I want the head of John the Baptist. And that's how John the Baptist is executed. Herod Antipas has had him in the palace at over there at Machaerus on the opposite side of the Dead Sea from Jerusalem. So the crowds don't have easy access to him. But Herod's fascinated by him. Herod Antipas is fascinated by him and always goes and talks to him. So he doesn't want to kill him, but when Salome puts him on the spot, he keeps his word and he kills him. Herod Agrippa, I won't write all these up. Agrippa the first has a child named Herod Agrippa King Herod Agrippa the II. So in the book of Acts, he's the one that Paul gives his defense for. Also Felix is a child of that. So you've got a huge influence on the New Testament by this one person. So when you think about Herod the Great, He shapes Israel in so many ways. He shapes them religiously because he builds the temple. He gives them sort of a national pride. Now that you can argue that's a really bad thing, and Jesus points that out to them. But he gives them a temple, so he shapes them religiously. He shapes them architecturally, and even just the quality of life. Herod was, one reason why he could stay popular was he's employing so many people. All these building projects all over the country, that's putting a lot of people to work. And that's why the day he dies, the work stops. They're like, well, we don't think anybody else is going to make this kind of an investment, and they just stopped. And indeed, Herod's sons are like Archelaus. So when Herod dies, Rome does not allow any of his sons to be called king. So they become tetrarch. Archelaus is given rule over Jerusalem, and he's so incompetent that Rome removes him as a tetrarch and starts putting in Roman governors instead of letting a descendant of Herod do it. And then that's how Pontius Pilate gets to Jerusalem. By the way, Pontius Pilate's headquarters is in Caesarea. The only external evidence we have outside the Bible for the existence of Pontius Pilate is they found an inscription at Caesarea with his name on it, Pontius Pilatus in Latin, and the real stone's in the Israel Museum, but when you go to Caesarea, they've got a replica of it made there that you see. So, man, just look at the influence of this guy. It's massive. He is, like Israel itself, a bundle of contradictions. You see some aspirations of faithfulness, but then you see such idolatry. You see brilliance, and you see insanity. I mean, a great builder, yet he'll kill his own wives and children. I'll tell you this. He dies in 4 BC. Remember that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph are down in Egypt. God told them to leave and go down to Egypt until Herod died. As Herod is dying, and he dies a horrible death, he's got some disease that just breaking out, his sores all over his body. He stinks. It's a putrid smell to be in the room with him. And he's miserable. And he knows he's so hated that when he dies, there'll be parties thrown, celebrations. So he orders that all the ruling class in Israel, the priest and those that are wealthy in Jerusalem, they are all arrested and taken to the hippodrome in Jericho. And Herod gives the order to his sister and brother that when he dies, they are to be executed, so that on the day he dies, there will be lamentation in Israel. Now that's just, do you get meaner than that? He doesn't want anybody rejoicing when he dies, and he knows they will, so he orders that all these people be murdered so people will mourn at his death. But Josephus tells us that they did not follow through the order. You can imagine these guys are in the hippodrome, and they've been told they're going to be killed. Herod dies, but then Herod's sister lets them go, and they all go back to their lives. I can't even imagine what that must have felt like. And then Jesus, Mary, and Joseph come back from Egypt at his death. So fascinating guy. He figures prominently in the New Testament. He shapes the Gospels and the book of Acts. Much of the action that happens there is some way connected to him because of the temple, because of Caesarea, because of the roads, because of the water system. All of that goes back to Herod the Great. I don't know how one person can be so brilliant and so insane. I don't get it. He's a bundle of contradictions, and he's so politically savvy that he could stay in favor with Rome his whole life and never crossed that line, and yet so inept at ruling his own people that, he kills his own wife and kids, and really kills a lot of his own people. So, fascinating guy. There are a lot of books out there on him. If there's any one that I think you might enjoy reading, there's one called, it's Herod the Great, King of the Jews, Friend of the Romans. And it's a good. There's a lot of good histories out there of him that are just, I think, fun. If you like reading historical stuff, those are good. There's a lot of really technical stuff out there too about, like, Netzer has written several things before he died about the architecture of Herod the Great. But Herod the Great, King of the Jews, Friend of the Romans is a good one if you want to read more. And I hope you're as fascinated by biblical history as I am, because think about it. It's into this kind of a world that Jesus comes. With all the power brokers, Caesar Augustus, and by the way, remember, that's how Luke starts. Luke chapter 2, he tells us who all is ruling. And in the middle of all these great rulers, power brokers, comes a baby who's the Son of God. It's a striking picture, and I think it's one that the New Testament paints for us very vividly. So hope that's a blessing to you. Praise the Lord that our King is a faithful King, and a blessing to us, and escaped the clutches of Herod the Great.